We're approaching Christmas 2025. I can't believe that the year is almost over. And for the final episode of 2025, I thought it would be fun to do something related to the holiday. I'm sure that you've heard the words of the famous Christmas hymn, "I Heard the Bells on Christmas Day." But do you know who penned the words and under what circumstances? Knowing this brings a lot more depth of meaning to the traditional Christmas hymn. To learn more, join me for today's episode of All Things Apostolic. Henry Wadsworth Longfellow is one of my favorite poets. He was born in Portland, Maine, which was then still part of Massachusetts, on February 27, 1807, the second son in a family of 8 children. His mother, Zilpah, was the daughter of a Revolutionary War hero. His father, Stephen Longfellow, was a Harvard graduate, prominent attorney, and later a member of Congress. Growing up, Henry loved the excitement of books, and at just 13 years of age, he was determined to try his hand at writing. Although his father would have preferred for him to pursue a reputable and solid field like law, Henry loved writing. He attended Bowdoin College, and one of his companions was Nathaniel Hawthorne. In preparation to become a professor of modern languages and literature, he spent 3 years traveling around Europe, living with families in Paris, Madrid, and Rome, and developing linguistic fluency. He became conversant in French and Spanish. He could read Portuguese with ease, and he spoke Italian like a national. He returned home to his position as a professor. He married Mary Potter, the daughter of Judge Barrett Potter. On a second European trip, Henry and his wife and 2 of his wife's friends traveled to Sweden, Denmark, and the Netherlands. Unfortunately, his wife Mary suffered a miscarriage while they were in Amsterdam, and then her health declined for several weeks until she passed away, leaving Henry grief-stricken. But during his travels abroad, Henry later met his future wife, Frances, who was the daughter of a wealthy Boston merchant, and they ended up marrying about 8 years later. Henry returned from his second European trip and became a professor at Harvard. Later, he made a third trip to Europe, where he deepened an earlier acquaintance with Charles Dickens. Inspired by social concerns, Henry devoted the voyage home to writing 7 of the 8 poems published on his return, called Poems on Slavery. Henry expressed his views on slavery in a letter to his friend. He said, quote, "I believe slavery to be an unrighteous institution based on the false maxim that might makes right. I believe that everyone has a perfect right to express his opinion on the subject of slavery as on every other thing, that everyone ought so to do until the public opinion of all Christendom shall penetrate into and change the hearts of the Southerners on this subject." After Frances and Henry married, they had 6 children, and the marriage was an exceptionally happy one that brought domestic stability. Interestingly, the more that Henry studied, translated, and taught the literature of the other countries, the more his heart yearned for a national voice of his own country. You see, the United States was only about 30 years old when Henry was born. it did not have the rich, expansive history that poets and authors of other countries drew from in their writings. Henry longed for a writer of American literature who would well represent what was noble and beautiful about the United States and its English language. So he set to work to do what he could do to contribute to the stories of noble literature worldwide, but especially regarding his native land. His house, which was a gift from his wife's father, had a rich history of its own, for it had been the headquarters of General George Washington during the Revolutionary War. And from that house, Henry wrote about all aspects of life, shipwrecks and slavery, as well as snowflakes and songs. Henry published volumes of poetry as his family grew. Americans all across the country embraced his work. And through the years, with each new book, the publishers would print more copies than before, and they would be all snatched up with equally increasing enthusiasm. At the age of 47, Henry was able to resign his teaching post at Harvard. He had become one of America's first self-sustaining authors, and for the next 7 years, unimpeded by teaching duties, Henry was able to pour his energies into his writing, supported by the love of his family. Unfortunately, after 18 years of marriage, that bliss was shattered. There are different accounts of what happened, but Frances may have been using a candle to seal packets of her daughter's curls. Somehow, Frances's dress caught on fire, and she suffered fatal burns. She died the next day. Henry suffered severe burns to his hands, arms, and face, smothering the fire. He was also left with severe facial sensitivity that precluded shaving thereafter and forced him to grow the white beard that is recognizable in later portraits. He was also left with heavy responsibilities for his family and with intense grief. A month after Frances's death, Henry gave voice to his despair in a letter to his late wife's sister. He wrote, quote, "How am I alive after what my eyes have seen? I know not. I am at least patient, if not resigned, and thank God hourly, as I have from the beginning, for the beautiful life we led together, and that I loved her more and more to the end." While coping with private tragedy at home, he suffered the additional trauma of the Civil War. The Civil War began the same year as Frances's death. His son Charles enlisted in the Union Army against his father's wishes. And at some point, Charles was wounded while fighting. In the midst of the Civil War, shortly after learning of his son's injuries, Henry wrote the poem called Christmas Bells. Church bells ringing on Christmas Day proclaimed peace, but the reality of war made those words feel hollow. This tension between the ideal of peace and the reality of conflict is central to the poem. The poem begins with hope, speaking of peace on earth and goodwill to men. But then the black cannons roar, and hate seems stronger than love. Peace feels distant and unreachable. However, the poem concludes with a firm declaration that God is not dead, nor doth he sleep. The wrong shall fail, the right prevail, with peace on earth, goodwill to men. The words of Henry Wadsworth Longfellow were penned in 1863 and later put to music. Usually only the beginning stanzas and the last stanza are sung, so most people are unaware that the song addresses one of the darkest periods of American history. And here's how it goes. I heard the bells on Christmas Day, their old familiar carols play, and wild and sweet the words repeat of peace on earth, goodwill to men. And thought how, as the day had come, the belfries of all Christendom had rolled along the unbroken song of peace on earth, goodwill to men. Till ringing, singing on its way, the world revolved from night to day, a voice, a chime, a chant sublime of peace on earth, goodwill to men. Then from each black accursed mouth the cannon thundered in the south, and with the sound the carols drowned of peace on earth, goodwill to men. It was as if an earthquake rent the hearthstones of a continent and made forlorn the households born of peace on earth, goodwill to men. And in despair I bowed my head. There is no peace on earth, I said, for hate is strong and mocks the song of peace on earth, goodwill to men. Then pealed the bells more loud and deep. God is not dead, nor doth he sleep. The wrong shall fail, the right prevail, with peace on earth, goodwill to men. As Henry aged, his wealth and fame grew. He made his final trip to Europe when he was 61 years old, and grieving the loss of his beloved wife, Frances. During the 18 months abroad, he spent a day with the Queen of England at Windsor Castle, and he enjoyed a pleasant 2-day visit with Alfred Lord Tennyson. Henry Wadsworth Longfellow was one of the most widely known and best-loved American poets of the 19th century. Everywhere he went, he was acclaimed and celebrated, for he had become the national voice that he had been looking for. During this Christmas season, there is sometimes a bitter irony between the lights and the festivities, while there is also social division and global conflict. Some people are celebrating, while some people are suffering. And peace on multiple levels may feel elusive. Some people may even feel depressed or hopeless during this season. But this poem is powerful because it acknowledges suffering without letting it become despair. It chooses hope. Even when the world seems chaotic, God is active and God is in control. And wrong will not have the final word. Right will eventually prevail. More than ever, we need to be secure in knowing that God is in control. We need to pray for peace, and in our own lives, do whatever we can to show goodwill to others. Let our lives be the church bells that ring loudly and deeply, demonstrating that God is not dead, nor doth he sleep. The wrong shall fail, the right prevail, with peace on earth, goodwill to men. Thank you for joining me for today's episode of All Things Apostolic, and until next time, have a very Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year.